Hi, this is the cell membrane screencast project by Andrew and Kevin. Cell membranes are very important, and they're also known as the plasma membrane or the lipid bilayer. So the essential component of these membranes is the phospholipid, which has a hydrophobic tails and hydrophilic head. The hydrophilic part is the glycerol and phosphate group, while the hydrophobic part are the two fatty acid chains. Notice how one of them has a kink in it. So these phospholipids, they are very picky. So the hydrophobic part wants to be away from water, and the hydrophilic part wants to be with water. This causes them to naturally go into these lipid bilayer conformations in an aqueous solution, and this is optimal because the hydrophobic parts are not touching water, while the hydrophilic parts are in contact with water, so everything is satisfied. The plasma membrane is not just the phospholipids, though. There are many different groups inside. It's very diverse, such as glycoproteins, membrane proteins, peripheral proteins, integral proteins, cholesterol, and more. So this is also known as the fluid mosaic model because, first of all, the membrane is very fluid. The phospholipids will change places with each other very, very fast, and it's always in motion. It's not stationary at all. Additionally, it also resembles a mosaic because of the many proteins and components that dot it and give it a lot of different shapes and characteristics. There are two main types of proteins, peripheral proteins and integral proteins. The main difference is that integral proteins go through the bilayer, and they'll often have hydrophobic regions to be compatible with the hydrophobic inside of the bilayer. There are many different types of proteins as well, such as transport proteins, signal transduction proteins, cell-cell recognition proteins, proteins that join cells together, and proteins that connect things that are part of the extracellular matrix or the cytoskeleton.
Membrane permeability. So this is a diagram of a cell membrane, and it shows the nonpolar fatty acid tails in the middle and the polar phosphate heads on the outside of the membrane. So this structure influences because there's a large nonpolar zone in the middle, so as a result, the nonpolar uncharged molecules will form favorable interactions, unlike the charged polar molecules, and as a result, they'll be able to readily diffuse across the membrane, while charged polar ones won't be able to. And molecules that don't pass freely across the membrane need to use transport proteins. So the two main classes are protein channels and carrier proteins. And protein channels are just channels in the membrane which allow molecules to go through, and carrier proteins are proteins which undergo a conformational change which allows molecules to go in and then out on the other side of the membrane. And water is an example of a molecule that cannot pass freely across the membrane because it's polar. So the cells have aquaporin, which are protein channels with hydrophilic interiors which allow water to diffuse across. So cell walls are important for cell function and structure because they help give the cell rigidity and help them maintain their structure. For example, in a hypotonic solution where there would be a net movement of water into the cell, and the cell wall would prevent the cell from lysing. So it helps it maintain structure and helps it maintain its shape, which is important for function. So membrane transport. Passive diffusion is transport without input of energy, and there's diffusion, osmosis, and facilitated diffusion. So diffusion is just molecules diffusing across a membrane without any help. Osmosis is water diffusing across a selectively permeable membrane from a region of low to high concentration. Facilitated diffusion is diffusion across a membrane using proteins without input of energy. And active transport is transport when energy is inputted. So that means that it's going against their concentration gradient. So an example of this is the sodium-potassium pump. The cell expends ATP to move sodium and potassium ions against their concentration gradient. Bulk transport is how large molecules are moved in and out of cells. There's endocytosis and exocytosis. Both require energy. Exocytosis of that outside of the membrane just uses the membrane, and the inside spills out. And then for endocytosis, there is phagocytosis, which is when the cell's membrane extends around and engulfs a particle and then forms a vesicle which buds into the cell. And then pinocytosis, the cell membrane buds off into itself and forms vesicles. And receptor-mediated endocytosis, molecules bind to receptors on the membrane, and then that part of the membrane folds in and forms a vesicle and buds off into the interior of the cell.